My darkness has been filled with the light of intelligence, and behold, the outer daylit world was stumbling and groping in social blindness.
Hello, and welcome to this webcast. I'm Robert White. The following presentation is based on the findings from my PhD research, which was conducted between 2006 to 2010 at the Department of Architecture at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow.
Worldwide, it is estimated that more than 314 million people are visually impaired, of which 269 million have low vision and 45 million are blind. Every day in the UK, 100 people begin to lose their eyesight. Current figures suggest that there could be as many as 2.3 million people living in the UK with a visual impairment, out of which 2.2 million are aged 65 years and over, 47,000 are adults, and 30,000 are children. The term blind rarely means that a person sees nothing at all. In fact, 82% of the entire visually impaired population have some residual vision, 14% have some light perception, and only 4% see nothing at all. Vision can be compromised by damage to any of the structures that make up the eye, or transmit the visual image to the brain. The spectrum of impairment is therefore wide, but as a general rule, these conditions can be divided into 4 groups relating to the type of vision loss: central vision loss, peripheral vision loss, mixed vision loss, and blindness. Visual impairment prevalence in the UK is expected to double from 2.3 million to around 4 million by the year 2030, meaning that over 5.5% of the UK population would be visually impaired by 2030. The substantial estimated expansion in the visually impaired population has strong links to the changing demographics of the UK population, in addition to increasingly unhealthy lifestyle choices. Ageing population. The latest population statistics for the UK are estimated to be close to 61.4 million. This figure is expected to increase to 65.6 million in 2018 and reach 71.6 million by 2033. The low birth rate and increasing life expectancy mean that this growth in population size is not accompanied by a proportionate change of numbers in different age groups. This is particularly evident for those aged 60 years and over. It is expected that this age group will increase significantly from 12.9 million in 2006 to 20 million in 2031, representing a 6.8% increase within the total UK population. As people age, they are increasingly likely to suffer from health problems, including complications with their vision. In fact, an estimated 97% of the visually impaired population is aged 65 years and over. It is estimated that between 964,000 and 1.15 million of the elderly population suffer from a mild visual impairment, and between 676,000 and 1,036,000 are affected by moderate to severe vision loss. Approximately half of all cases of vision loss are caused by untreated cataracts or refractive error, and the other half by untreatable conditions such as age-related macular degeneration, or AMD. The number of cases of AMD is likely to increase as the population grows older, and unless any advances in the treatment of AMD arise, it is anticipated that there will be an additional 20,000 to 24,000 more cases of registerable AMD among those aged 70 years and over by the year 2020. For those aged 85 years and over, estimates show that over a quarter have either a moderate or severe visual impairment. This figure compares to 8.5% of those aged between 75 and 84, and 5.6% of those aged between 65 and 74. Obesity epidemic. A person is classified as being obese when their body mass index, or BMI, exceeds 30. In England, approximately 25% of adults and 10% of children are obese. Similar figures have been recorded in Scotland, with 22% of men and 24% of women classified as obese. It is anticipated that by 2025, 40% of the UK population will be obese, and will increase further to more than 50% by 2050. By 2050, as many as 60% of men, 50% of women, and 25% of children could be obese. These statistics will have major consequences on the future size of the visually impaired population, as obesity is associated with a number of different eye conditions, including AMD, diabetic retinopathy, cataracts, glaucoma, and diseases of the eye caused by cardiovascular disease. Obesity significantly increases the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. Individuals with an BMI of over 30 are 10 times more likely to develop diabetes than someone with a normal body weight. A person who has lived with a BMI of 35 or greater for more than 10 years is 80 times more likely to develop diabetes than a person with a BMI of less than 22. It is anticipated that the obesity epidemic will lead to a diabetes epidemic, which will in turn see a significant increase in cases of diabetic retinopathy, as 60% of individuals with type 2 diabetes will eventually develop the disease. Obesity may also increase the risk of developing AMD. Individuals with a BMI of over 25 have a 1.5 times increased risk of developing the condition, whereas those with a BMI of over 30 are twice as likely to develop the disease compared to a person of normal weight. Those with a family history of AMD, who are known to have a genetic predisposition for developing the disease, should take extra care to maintain a healthy body weight, as their risk of developing AMD will rise from 4 times with a normal body weight to an 11 times increase when obese. There is a strong link between obesity and the prevalence of cataracts. Individuals with a BMI over 30 are twice as likely to develop cataracts compared to someone with a normal body weight. Studies have shown that obesity has a direct link to a rise in intraocular pressure, which, if left untreated, can lead to the development of glaucoma. With over 2 million visually impaired people living in the UK, and a substantial increase on the way, the key question has to be, are our towns and cities ready to accommodate the needs of the changing population?
One of the main motivating factors for conducting this research stems from my own personal experience. In 2003, while in the third year of studying architecture, I was diagnosed with a degenerative eye disease leading to a loss of central vision and colour blindness. From that point onwards, a world of choice, freedom and independence was transformed into a hostile landscape, imposing restrictions, social exclusion and isolation. There was the realisation that architecture is by nature a profession which predominantly caters for the fully able-bodied person, with a general disregard for the design requirements of the visually impaired population. Daily activities such as walking along a pavement, crossing a road or negotiating level changes became an extremely difficult and frightening prospect. As a designer, I was interested to find out whether other people with visual impairments different to mine experience similar problems while navigating within the built environment, and if so, can one design solution accommodate the needs of all types of visual field loss? Before answering this question, let's first have a look at the current regulations and guidelines in place specifically targeted to designing accessible urban environments for visually impaired users.
The current legislative framework focusing on disability and accessible environments consists of a number of documents, the application of which is either compulsory or advisory. At the highest level, the Disability Discrimination Act dictates civil rights specifically targeted to the disabled population within the UK. The Disability Discrimination Act, or DDA, was first introduced in 1995 and later amended and extended in 2005. The main aim of the Act is to promote civil rights and prevent discrimination. The Act makes it unlawful to discriminate against an individual or group due to their disability. Since its introduction, close to 11 million people with a disability or long-term illness now have legal rights with regards to employment, the provision of goods and services, education, and public transport. The legislation requires that public bodies actively promote equality of opportunity for disabled people. As such, it is unlawful for service providers to treat people less favourably for reasons relating to their disability. Service providers are required to make reasonable adjustments to the way in which they offer services and provide additional assistance in order to accommodate the needs of disabled people. Building regulations are in place to provide architects and designers with mandatory minimum standards for the design of elements within domestic and non-domestic buildings. The regulations responsible for ensuring the accessibility and usability of a building are provided in Section 4, Safety, of the Building Regulations for Scotland. The standards within this section aim to limit the risk levels to users of buildings and reduce the number of accidents, particularly in the case of the elderly and disabled populations. Design standards for external environments are limited to the design of access routes between a road and the principal building entrance, and access routes between any accessible car parking provided within the curtilage of the building. The regulations fail to provide any mandatory standards for the design of spaces and routes between buildings in the built environment on a wider scale. For this reason, designers are required to source additional information from guidance documents such as British Standards BS 8300 and Inclusive Mobility. The information contained within both documents is entirely advisory. British Standards BS 8300 is a guidance document concerned with the design of new buildings and their approaches, in order to cater for the needs of the disabled population. As a code of practice offering guidance and recommendations, the standards within BS 8300 are not enforceable by law. The guidance applies to accessible car parking provision, access routes to and around all buildings, and the entrances and interiors of new buildings. The recommendations also incorporate guidance regarding accessible routes to facilities associated with and in the immediate vicinity of buildings. The recommendations in the guidance document augment the specifications of the building regulations by extending guidance outside the curtilage of the building to include access routes that connect buildings to public transport terminals. However, similarly to the building regulations, the remit of the British standards fails to provide comprehensive guidance regarding the design of exterior public spaces located beyond the immediate proximity of buildings and public transport nodes. The Inclusive Mobility Guidelines were published by the Department of Transport in 2002 and later updated in 2005. The guidelines build on the specifications of the DDA and BS 8300 in order to cover omissions and supply updated guidance for designing accessible urban environments. The overall objective of the guide is to provide inclusive design and through that achieve social inclusion. The recommendations cover a wide spectrum of features ranging from pedestrian and street environments to public transport buildings and infrastructure.
In a previous study, it was found that 30% of people with a visual impairment make no independent journeys outside of their home.
The majority of those who do venture out adhere to known routes because exploration can lead to disorientation, chaos, and the fear, stress, and panic associated with being lost.
Could the lack of mandatory regulations for the design of external environments explain why so many visually impaired people are reluctant to travel independently? And if so, what additional design recommendations are required in order to create a more universally accessible built environment to cater for the needs of all visually impaired pedestrians?
This question was explored through a nationwide survey targeted at visually impaired users of the built environment. The survey was followed by an access audit, which aims to quantify the number and type of hazards present within a typical city centre. The research was complemented by a series of user-based navigational experiments, which situate the problem through comparison of experiences between visually impaired and fully sighted cases.
Throughout this presentation, I will be joined by two visually impaired residents of Glasgow, Colette and Alex, who will share their experiences of the difficulties that they face navigating the city on a daily basis.
Questionnaire.
In order to access facilities, goods and services by foot, pedestrians often encounter and make use of pavements, pedestrian precincts, level changes, and controlled or uncontrolled crossing points over major and minor roads. Certain features within the built environment can prove to be problematic and potentially hazardous to pedestrians of all abilities. However, the risk to individuals with a sensory or mobility impairment can be much greater and occur on a more frequent basis. Guidance in place to improve the access requirements for people with a visual impairment is often specific to the internal aspects of a building and may fail to address the implementation of inclusive design methods within the surrounding areas of a building, or the built environment on a wider scale. This often leads to a situation whereby accessible buildings are sometimes located in inaccessible places. In order to identify which features within the external built environment present the most difficulties to the visually impaired population, a nationwide survey was deployed, giving the visually impaired community the opportunity to rate the features they found the most problematic and hazardous. The main topics of investigation related to independent travel behaviour, the wish for more independent travel, psychological and physical barriers preventing independent travel, problematic pavement features, hazardous items of street furniture, colour and contrast combinations, and daylight and weather conditions that affect navigation. A total of 212 participants completed the questionnaire, out of which 44% were male and 56% female. 21% of respondents reported loss of central vision, 20% reported loss of peripheral vision, 37% had mixed vision loss, 15% were blind, and 7% chose other. A total of 56 different eye conditions were recorded. The top 4 most common conditions were retinitis pigmentosa, macular degeneration, glaucoma, and cataract. The age distribution of participants ranged from 18 years to 85 years, with the highest proportion of respondents found in the 65 years and over age group. Participants were diagnosed with their eye condition throughout all stages of life, allowing for observations to be made as to the effect, if any, that the age of onset of visual impairment has on the difficulties experienced when navigating within the built environment. 63.9% of respondents stated that they use a mobility aid. This included the use of a symbol cane, long cane, and guide dog. 9.3% reported using other mobility aids, of which 5.2% involved the use of a sighted companion. No one reported using electronic travel aids, which could be due to the high cost and low availability of such equipment. A significant proportion of respondents, amounting to 36%, reported using no mobility aid, preferring instead to use their residual vision rather than use a mobility aid and be labelled as blind. A key finding of the survey revealed that almost 1/3 of all respondents made no independent journeys to their nearest town or city centre. There was found to be a high demand to make more independent journeys, with over half of all respondents expressing the desire to increase their independent travel behaviour. An investigation into the factors responsible for preventing independent travel demonstrates that visually impaired people are less disabled by personal factors such as fear, stress, and level of confidence, and are more disabled by the design and physical influence of features within the built environment. The survey results also highlight that physical elements are more of a deterrent to independent travel than a lack of spatial awareness or cognitive mapping abilities.
I'm Colette. I've been visually impaired all my life. I'm now registered blind. I I'm a very independent person. I like to travel on my own, but due to the lack of knowledge through architecture, structures out there, I find it more difficult to access different areas outside in the Glasgow area where I have to travel. I use a very good mapping system that I've devised over the years, but again, problems due to lack of knowledge out there makes it more difficult for me out in the Glasgow city centre area.
And I'm Alex. I lost my sight about 15 years ago. I had a fairly good sight before then, so now when I wander around the environment, I continually see things that I took for granted before, but now I've got to use a lot more of my mental ability to remember layouts and how streets wind their way through the city. So I've got to take a lot more care than I used to do when I had full vision. I think my eyes before took in a lot more information and processed it to the brain than I realised before. But now, when I don't have that, I find I come across obstacles very, very quickly and painfully. And I think it's just through maybe lack of thought. Sometimes I think I'm not a designer or anything like that, but I could think if someone asked me or asked people like Colette, what would be the best way of putting this in the environment, we could maybe give them a bit more information that would be less painful.
Uneven paving, location, and presence of street furniture and unexpected level changes were highlighted as the most problematic features associated with pavement design.
I find especially Glasgow city centre, when you're out and about, the most problematic for pavements is the reflectiveness of them now. They're trying to make them like the mosaic designs to make them all look nice and sleek. When it rains, it's very reflective, the sun comes out. Also, the curb isn't marked properly then because they're trying to keep it all nice and sleek, so they don't have the distinguishing colours as well. So I don't know what you find with that.
Well, the definition, I like the definition between the curb and the road. That's what my eyes pick up on. Yeah, and I think there is designers seem to like this kind of high gloss, shiny pavements, and when you're approaching the road, then they've got the drop down curb for the level, but if they've got to be really careful that level does exist, because if they come along a year later and resurface the road, you can find the level actually blends with the pavement. I think coming down Renfield Street at Glasgow Central, the curb is actually flush with the road. So if I'm going along with my cane, it's hard to feel the difference between the drop-down curb because it doesn't exist anymore.
And also, even in like Buchanan Street now, they've got steps that lead up to different areas for the shops, but there's no markings on them. There's no banisters. There's no allocation again of where they are, especially when you're coming down. Maybe sometimes it's slightly easier to see them going up, but especially when somebody's visually impaired going down, there's nothing to show. If
you were like a visually impaired person coming from out of town and you came across that, now that would be a potential hazard.
Totally.
The hazardous nature of items of street furniture was also investigated. Bollards were highlighted as the most hazardous, followed by litter bins, outside dining areas, and signage including road signs and A boards.
The furniture around the city centre is, I think, it's phenomenal. The amount of furniture they've got there. I suppose it's to make it pretty and maybe make it look more aesthetic, but I find that it's getting more and more hazardous for me to get round about, and there's more people coming out with tables and chairs, and shops are trying to gain more business. By putting A-frames out, A-boards out, trying to advertise business. Even
in pedestrian thoroughfares, the bollards they put up as well, what is the reason for them? They're a hazard in themselves, like easily to walk into them.
What about wheelie bins? The wheelie bins seem to
for
be...
the shops and the restaurants, there's more of them as well, because there's more cafes, there's more
I guess now we're recycling more and more, so you get more different types of bins. They can be a lot of hazard.
With respect to colour and contrast combinations within the built environment, the survey responses show a general trend favouring the visibility of warm, bright, vibrant colours, and also establish silver as the most difficult colour to identify. The three least visible colours, silver, green and blue, were identical for each visual field loss category. This result is significant as it provides guidance on colour choices that can improve the visibility of features within the built environment for all types of visual field loss.
Another thing with the bollards and the seating areas that they have, they try and make them, I don't know what you think, they make them very stylish, but like silver and granite.
Stainless steel.
And again, when it's very sunny or very cloudy, it makes them totally, I don't know about you, but invisible to me almost.
Because they reflect the colour round about the environment. Now,
and again, there isn't a nice even contrast from the pavement to them, so it makes it very difficult. Again, the bollards can be all different widths as well with the colours, so if they're very thin silver...
They're almost like a spear. There's ones in Glasgow that are about, I think they're about 2 inches in diameter, and they seem to be pointy at the top, and they're just about like rib height, just about in there. So if you miss them, now it can be really quite lethal. Yeah,
and again, there's certain bollards even in Argyll Street that are an almost like a stone colour, which again they completely blend in, and they're knee height. So if you don't see them, you know, that's your kneecap.
The ones that are just about a foot tall. They're sore. They're difficult as well.
There was general agreement among all vision loss categories as to the most suitable colour contrast combinations for use in the three scenarios of stair and edge strip, pavement and bollard, and pavement, kerb and road. The four main colours to be used were black or grey in combination with yellow or white in any of these scenarios.
And I'd prefer for a lot better contrast in the city. There seems to be, they go out their way to put all these wonderful bits of street furniture, but then they do their best to hide them by making it blend into the background. Now grey granite on a kind of grey paving stone. So any ideas for different colours?
Well, what I would prefer in an ideal world, which I know it's not, is a black, dark tarmacked pavement with a white curb edge, and then a grey road.
Right, so everything's different.
It's a complete contrast, you know, it's a complete contrast then, because...
Do you know what would be good? A licorice all sort type of world. Now you get your yellow, black, white, then all different types of contrast. Licorice all sorts are really good contrast.
But I think that if the pavements were black, then if the bollards were, say, white of colour, you know, then obviously they would be able to see them better. So of course the dark then blends in with the bollard, so that would make it a lot easier as well. And again, with even with the street furniture being, you know, of the silver nature, you'd maybe be able to see that better as well.
So it wouldn't reflect this environment about it.
Finally, there was found to be a link between the responses of individuals who use a mobility aid and those who do not. In particular, those who use a mobility aid rated factors and features as more influential, problematic and hazardous than individuals who travel without the use of an aid. These results indicate that the use of a mobility aid alone does not eliminate the hazardous nature of the built environment for the visually impaired pedestrian.
Access audit. Gutters become chasms, sidewalks and streets become treacherous paths, stairs may be impossible cliffs.
After establishing the main barriers to access for people with a visual impairment, an access audit was conducted within Glasgow city centre, which aimed to quantify the number and type of hazards present within a typical built environment.
The three main areas of investigation focused on pavement characteristics, street furniture, and pedestrian crossings. A total of 35 streets and 2 squares were audited within the boundaries of Glasgow city centre, encompassing shared space zones, public squares, pedestrian areas, and streets of varying vehicular and pedestrian traffic flow. The analysis of everyday spaces within the study area highlights the problematic nature of street design, to the disadvantage of not only the visually impaired pedestrian, but people of all abilities. Thereafter, an interactive map was created, providing in-depth information of particular hazards at exact locations on a street-by-street basis.
It was evident that the dominance of the car disadvantages the pedestrian on a number of levels. The main problem being the high frequency of road signage positioned in pavements, often zoned in the centre of the pavement and poorly contrasting with the surrounding environment.
One of the things that makes me really nervous about coming independently into Glasgow is road signages. This one here is static, which you can actually remember is here if you do a mapping system, which most visually impaired people do. But you get the mobile road signages that are on a metal A-frame. The reason why I'm really nervous about these is because one of the times I had an incident that I was walking along a pavement and the back of it was facing me. Due to its colour contrast, I didn't see it. I hit the base bar with my ankle, which made me stumble forward. As I stumbled forward, my chin hit the middle bar, which then made me actually hang by my neck over this bar. So I think you can understand that these things actually have to be better contrasted or put into a different area so that the pedestrians isn't a hazard for pedestrians.
Another problem is pavements breaking unnecessarily to allow vehicular access into lanes and car parks. This creates unexpected level changes, as opposed to a design solution whereby the pedestrian has priority over the vehicle. A third problem relates to the high frequency of street furniture placed on pavements as a means of controlling vehicular movement, such as bollards and protective barriers. Within the study area, a large number of different paving types were found to be in use, creating an environment of contrasting patterns and colours. Some were found to be beneficial in providing cues to the pedestrian, and others detrimental, causing confusion due to the choice of colour and material, particularly highly patterned paving. Certain materials were found to react and alter in appearance under varying weather conditions, often resulting in shiny, glossy surfaces with glare and reflection, further contributing to the disabling nature of the environment. There was also found to be a large variation in curb heights across the study area, which can lead to uncertainty over the difference in height between the pavement and road at any two given points along the same street. This was particularly the case in parts of the city that had not undergone regeneration. However, some regenerated areas still pose a significant risk due to the inconsistent design of newly laid curb edges. Inevitably, the pavement widths varied between different streets within the study area. However, at several locations, the pavement width reduced significantly as a result of the poor zoning of subway entrances and street furniture, leading to pedestrian congestion.
There was found to be a high presence of street furniture within the study area, with the bollard being the most prevalent. Interestingly, this was cited as the most hazardous item by the visually impaired survey participants.
There is a clear difference between the design of old and new street furniture. The majority of modern street furniture is silver-coloured or stainless steel, which was highlighted in the survey as being the least visible colour among all types of visual field loss. Older street furniture is generally black, which was rated as more visible in the survey. The zoning of street furniture was also noted as a concern, with many items poorly positioned and obstructing pedestrian flow. Examples include the placement of trees, bollards, bins, and lampposts in the centre of the pavement, creating a collision hazard and the potential for accidents and injuries. The presence of unmarked level changes was a key issue during the audit. For a level change to be accessible, both visual and tactile cues should be used. However, only one such example was found within the audited area. The incorporation of landscape steps within pedestrianised areas of the city introduces hidden and unnecessary dangers, while ramped steps may be visible from below, but from above it's a different picture.
One thing I find it very hazardous is unmarked steps. Unlike these steps that have got high contrast black lines on them, steps that actually blend into the environment are very hazardous. If I was coming along, on one occasion I came along and I missed the step completely, the top step, because it wasn't marked, and I flew straight out into fresh air. And when I eventually landed, I ended up breaking my hand and my thumb, and I was in plaster for about 6 weeks because of that. So good contrast and good definition at steps I find very, very important.
The design and layout of pedestrian crossings constantly changes throughout the city. All controlled crossing points should be equipped with red L-shaped tactile blister paving, a spinning cone, audible signal and a dropped curb. In cases where tactile paving is used, there was found to be a variety of colours and materials. Additionally, the location of tactile spinning cones was inconsistent at several crossing points. This non-standardised design approach further complicates the visually impaired pedestrian's ability to navigate the city. A review of road crossings revealed that almost 1/3 of controlled crossing points were not equipped with assistive features, such as a tactile spinning cone or an audio signal, resulting in them being inaccessible to the visually impaired pedestrian. As a result, large areas of the city are effectively transformed into unreachable islands, placing the lives of visually impaired people at risk, severely limiting their movement and preventing them from accessing goods, facilities and services. Maintenance was a recurring issue which was found to affect all aspects of the built environment. Paving materials, kerb edges and drain covers were found to be cracked and missing. Items of street furniture were broken and positioned at dangerous angles, and pedestrian crossings suffered from vandalism and the breakdown of tactile spinning cones and weight light bulbs. Although these instances may not seem to pose a serious problem to the fully sighted pedestrian, they have a strong impact on the visually impaired individual. Repairing the broken and damaged elements within the city is a simple, straightforward measure which would bring instant benefits to visually impaired pedestrians.
Navigating the city.
To find out how the many design features identified within the questionnaire and access audit affect the movement of the visually impaired pedestrian, a series of navigational experiments were conducted between 2 specified points within Glasgow city centre.
A total of 15 visually impaired participants of varying age, type of vision loss, and age of diagnosis took part in the experiment alongside a control group consisting of 5 sighted participants. The main topics of investigation related to the time taken to complete the experiment, the number of steps taken and overall distance travelled, the route strategies adopted, and the level of spatial awareness and cognitive mapping abilities. The navigational experiments were performed on an individual basis and were designed to replicate as much as is reasonably possible a normal unaccompanied journey within a city centre environment. Each participant was given the same scenario. They have just arrived into Glasgow city centre, either by bus, taxi, train or underground, and are travelling to the Tron Theatre to watch a performance. They were then asked to plan their route and provide reasons for their decision. The planned route was compared with the actual route taken at the end of the journey. If the 2 routes differed, this was discussed in the post-experiment interview. The comparison between the route choice of the visually impaired and fully sighted participants was quite striking. All of the visually impaired participants, with the exception of one, opted for straight-line L-shaped routes, incorporating a limited number of streets and road crossings. All of the visually impaired participants avoided traversing diagonally through large open spaces such as public squares. all of the fully sighted participants completed their journey as the crow flies, incorporating an average number of 10 streets. All of the fully sighted participants preferred to make route decisions during their journey, as opposed to the visually impaired participants who pre-planned their route. During the planning stage, participants were first influenced by the location of accessible pedestrian crossings, followed by the presence of street furniture and the level of pedestrian flow, particularly at busy times of the day. Participants were aware that they could travel along a more direct route. However, they were limited in doing so by the inaccessible nature of the built environment. As a result, participants adhered to known routes, even when those routes took longer to complete, led to an increase in distance, or involved walking in the opposite direction from the end destination for part of their journey. Numerous problems were experienced by all visually impaired participants in relation to pavement design, street furniture, and road crossings, regardless of age, the type of visual field loss, the age of diagnosis, or the use of a mobility aid. As participants planned their routes around the positioning of known accessible pedestrian crossings, the main problems encountered during the experiment related to the design of pavements, including the presence and inappropriate zoning of street furniture, often narrowing the pavement and causing pedestrian congestion. There was a significant difference between the completion times of the visually impaired and fully sighted participants. The fully sighted group took an average time of 8 minutes 54 seconds, whilst the visually impaired participants delivered an average time of 17 minutes and 7 seconds, resulting in a completion time of twice that of their sighted counterparts. There was also a notable difference with regards to the number of steps taken and average distance travelled between both groups, with the visually impaired participants walking an additional average of 412 steps, or 310 metres. The experiment showed that the level of spatial awareness among the visually impaired participants is similar, if not the same, to that of their sighted counterparts, as 14 out of 15 were able to point in the correct quadrant of the starting point of the experiment while standing at the end location. The majority of participants, 67%, were able to imagine that they were standing at the start point of the route and point to the end destination, supporting the view that visually impaired individuals have developed cognitive mapping abilities. The findings from the navigational experiments have demonstrated that there are clear differences between the movement patterns of the visually impaired and fully sighted populations when navigating within a typical built environment. Individuals with a visual impairment took longer to complete the journey and undertook journeys of a greater distance. These differences are not due to a lack of understanding with regards to spatial orientation or cognitive mapping abilities, but are rather due to barriers inherent within the design of the built environment, which restrict movement to specific, pre-planned, rehearsed routes.
Street hazard rating and enhanced design guidelines.
After gaining an understanding of the design features which pose a hazard to the visually impaired pedestrian, the next stage of the research involved quantifying the number and type of hazards within the design of individual streets.
This information formed the basis for a street hazard rating calculation, whereby each street is awarded a percentage rating to reflect the overall accessibility for the visually impaired pedestrian. The calculation was also used as the basis for assessing the effectiveness of existing mandatory regulations and best practice guidance documents. This exercise assisted in identifying possible shortages in the current regulatory and advisory framework, examining how the percentage ratings were influenced by the presence of architectural features in the design of streets. The areas of investigation were categorised into 3 main sections, focusing on pavement characteristics, street furniture, and pedestrian crossings. Each design category has been assigned a separate percentage rating based on the hazardous nature and disabling effect it can have on the visually impaired pedestrian. The rating scores for each category were informed by the findings of the survey and the navigational experiments. The hazard rating calculations were used to form a colour-coded map of Glasgow city centre, which provides a visual representation of the current levels of accessibility with relation to specific streets and interconnections with the built environment on a wider scale. The rating scores varied significantly across the study area, with an accessibility rating of 25.7%, indicating poor accessible design, to a high rating of 80.7%, indicating good accessible design. The street hazard rating map clearly demonstrates the patchwork nature of the city centre, with hazardous streets intertwined among more accessible strips. It further emphasises the hazardous and restrictive nature of the built environment for persons with a visual impairment. Interestingly, the 3 least hazardous streets were all selected as the preferred route choice among the visually impaired participants during the navigational experiment. This indicates that the visually impaired population have instinctively developed their own street hazard rating map for frequently used areas of the city. It may perhaps be perceived that modernised areas of the city would provide more accessible environments for the visually impaired pedestrian. In reality, the opposite is true in many cases. Simply redeveloping and upgrading a street with new paving and street furniture does not necessarily produce a more accessible street environment. It can just as well introduce additional barriers that actually reduce the overall accessibility. This is particularly evident in the main pedestrian shopping areas of Glasgow city centre, which have new paving, street furniture and fully accessible pedestrian crossings. These were originally designed with the intention of improving the pedestrian environment. However, the poor choice of materials, fixtures and fittings has led to the creation of an environment with glare, reflection and dangerously positioned, low visibility street furniture. In contrast, less modernised streets of the city were generally absent from glare, reflection and obstacles.
Enhanced design guidelines.
The research concluded in the creation of enhanced guidelines, which augment current building regulations and best practice documents. The guidelines provide a set of recommendations that are informed by the views of the visually impaired population. This user-oriented design approach introduces recommendations relating to pavement design, level changes, street furniture, and pedestrian crossings. It is envisaged that the enhanced guidelines should not be treated as an optional extra, but rather be incorporated in the mandatory building regulations to provide equal access opportunities to pedestrians regardless of ability or location, either internal or external. The enhanced guidelines for the design of pavements focus on paving material, design and appearance of the paving surface, minimum pavement widths, and the design and appearance of curbs. In particular, the guidelines recommend that the paving material should have a matte finish with non-reflective properties under both wet and dry conditions in order to minimise the effects of glare. The use of highly patterned surfaces consisting of many individual elements should be avoided, as this can often introduce visual confusion and discomfort. A grayscale toned paving surface formed from a single, smooth, uniform material is preferable for principal areas of pedestrian traffic. An extension of 400 mm to the minimum pavement width recommended in best practice guidelines will allow 2 visually impaired pedestrians to pass in the opposite direction using either a long cane, guide dog, or a sighted guide. The adoption of a standard contrasting curb height eliminates the uncertainty regarding the vertical distance between the pavement and road at any 2 given points. The enhanced guidelines for the design and treatment of level changes highlight the importance of using a consistent riser and tread within the design of each separate flight. Tapered, landscaped or ramped steps should not be used due to the dangers they impose on the visually impaired pedestrian. The use of highly patterned and reflective surfaces should be avoided in favour of a smooth, uniform and continuous material. Stair edge strips of a standard width should be mandatory at every level change. In terms of colour contrast, the use of a black shed with either a yellow or white edge strip is preferable. Visually contrasting handrails of a standard height at every level change will provide support, guidance and relevant information to facilitate the safe passage of a change in level regardless of the number of risers. The guidelines for the design of street furniture focus on the three main areas of colour contrast, zoning and design and material. It is recommended that all items of street furniture should contrast visually both within the design and with the surrounding environment. The use of colours which contrast visually when viewed in both grayscale and colour will cater for the needs of the visually impaired pedestrian who is also affected by a loss of colour vision. Where street furniture has a practical function which justifies its placement on the pavement, items should be easily detectable with or without the use of a mobility aid, and have a design that minimises the effects of injury in the event of a collision. As a general rule, the enhanced guidelines recommend that silver-coloured stainless steel should not be used due to the glare, low visibility and reflective properties associated with such colour and material. A number of recommendations are introduced for the design and layout of pedestrian crossings. The recommendations call for more detailed specifications to be implemented for tactile paving. It is advised that all tactile paving surfaces should be made from a slip-resistant material and contain a contrasting border at controlled crossings in order to increase visibility. The guidelines recommend that both auditory and tactile facilities should be considered as mandatory requirements rather than an optional extra. Both the crossing pole and control box should provide a clear visual contrast with regards to the overall design and surrounding environment. The incorporation of additional contrasting bands on the crossing pole and use of LED displays on the control box are possible suggestions to improve visibility and accessibility. Finally, at controlled crossings, the provision of a surface which is different in colour and material to that of the surrounding carriageway or connecting pavements will introduce additional visual and tactile cues for the visually impaired pedestrian. With the introduction of enhanced guidelines comes the recognition that accessible design is sustainable design. If architects and planners create accessible, hazard-free environments in the first place, alterations at a later stage will not be required. This approach minimises the unnecessary consumption of fuel, materials and natural resources, which are needed in order to remove inaccessible features and reinstate alternative solutions.
I would like to thank you for watching this presentation, and to finish, I'll now leave you with a snapshot of some of the many comments from the visually impaired volunteers who took part in this research.